Hello, everyone. You are listening to Uncomfortable Truths for the Euclid Phoenix, where I talk about politics, religion, and other BS I find interesting. Today, for politics, we will take a look at America and Iran, a history of cooperation, conflict, and consequences. The relationship between the United States and Iran is one of the most complicated and controversial geopolitical stories of the modern era. At times, the two nations were allies. At other times, they became bitter enemies, locked in decades of hostility, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and political distrust. To understand modern tensions between the U.S. and Iran, we have to go back far beyond recent headlines about nuclear programs and Middle Eastern conflict. The roots stretched back to oil politics, Cold War fears, revolution, and repeated cycles of intervention and retaliation. In this episode, we're going to explore the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran, America's alliance with the Shah, the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War and Iran-Contra affair, nuclear tensions and sanctions, the modern conflict between the U.S. and Iran. This is not a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. It is a story filled with political fear, power struggles, ideology, nationalism, and long-term consequences. Iran before the revolution. Before 1979, Iran was not America's enemy. In fact, it was one of America's closest allies in the Middle East. In the early 20th century, Iran possessed enormous oil reserves. Much of that oil, however, was controlled by British interests through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Many Iranians believed foreign powers were exploited their country's resources while ordinary people remained poor. In the 1950s, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh decided to nationalize Iran's oil industry. This made him extremely popular within Iran, but deeply unpopular with Britain. Britain feared losing access to Iranian oil and sought help from the United States. At the same time, the Cold War was intensifying. American officials feared that instability in Iran could open the door for Soviet influence. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence helped orchestrate a coup that removed Mossadegh from power and strengthened the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The operation later became known as Operation Ajax. The Shah became a major American ally. For the United States, this seemed like a strategic victory during the Cold War, but for many Iranians, it became the monument America destroyed Iranian democracy. That memory would shape Iranian attitudes toward the United States for generations. The Shah and American influence. Following the coup, the Shah ruled Iran with strong American support. The United States provided military aid, economic assistance, intelligence cooperation. Iran became a key anti-Soviet ally in the Middle East. During this period, Iran modernized rapidly in some areas. Cities expanded, infrastructure improved, and oil wealth increased. Women gained more rights under the Shah's modernization programs. But there was another side to this story. The Shah's government became increasingly authoritarian. His secret police force, SAVAK, became notorious for censorship, torture, and political repression. Many Iranians viewed the Shah as a Western-backed dictator disconnected from ordinary people. Religious conservatives, leftists, nationalists, and students all became increasingly angry with the regime. Among the Shah's strongest critics was a religious figure named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The Iranian Revolution of 1979. By the late 1970s, protests against the Shah exploded across Iran. In 1979, the Shah fled the country. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, and Iran transformed a monarchy into an Islamic republic. This revolution dramatically changed U.S.-Iran relations. America had lost one of its strongest Middle Eastern allies. Then came the hostage crisis. In November 1979, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took Americans hostage. The hostages were held for 444 days. For Americans, the crisis came as a national humiliation. For many Iranians, the embassy takeover was partially fueled by fear that the United States might attempt another coup similar to 1953. This event permanently poisoned relationships between the two nations. Diplomatic ties between the United States and Iran were severed, and they remain severed today. The Iran-Iraq War and the Iran-Contra affair. In 1980, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the deadliest conflicts in the modern Middle East. The United States largely supported Iraq during the war, fearing the spread of Iran's revolutionary ideology across the region. But the situation became incredibly complicated. During the 1980s, members of the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran despite public hostility between the two countries. The profits from these secret arms deals were illegally used to support anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua called the Contras. This scandal became known as the Iran-Contra affair. It shocked Americans because the U.S. government was secretly dealing with a country it publicly described as an enemy. The affair revealed how geopolitical interests often override public political rhetoric. Nuclear tensions and sanctions. Another major source of conflict has been Iran's nuclear program. Ironically, Iran's nuclear program originally received assistance from the United States during the Shah's era under the Atoms for Peace initiative. But after the revolution, American attitudes changed dramatically. The United States and its allies accused Iran of seeking nuclear weapons. Iran repeatedly insisted its program was for peaceful energy purposes. Over time, sanctions on Iran intensified. These sanctions damaged Iran's economy severely, affecting banking, oil exports, international trade. Supporters of sanctions argued they were necessary to pressure Iran. Critics argued ordinary Iranian citizens suffered the most. In 2015, the Obama administration helped negotiate a joint comprehensive plan of action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to restrictions and inspections on its nuclear program in exchange for sanction relief. Supporters called it a major diplomatic breakthrough. Critics argued it did not go far enough. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement, and reimposed sanctions under a maximum pressure strategy. Tensions escalated sharply afterwards. Proxy conflict and modern tensions. In the recent decades, the U.S. and Iran have often avoided direct war while fighting through proxies and regional influence. Iran has supported groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, various militias in Iraq and Syria. The United States views many of these groups as destabilizing or terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, Iran views American military presence in the Middle East as a threat to its sovereignty and security. One of the most dramatic moments came in January 2020 when the United States assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike in Iraq. The U.S. described Soleimani as responsible for attacks on Americans. Iran viewed the assassination as an act of war. The two countries became dangerously close to direct military conflict. Why the relationship remains so hostile? The hostility between the United States and Iran is built on decades of mutual distrust. From the American perspective, Iran sponsors militant groups, threatens U.S. allies, pursues destabilizing regional policies. From the Iranian perspective, the U.S. overthrew Iran's government in 1953, supported an authoritarian Shah, imposed crippling sanctions, repeatedly interfered in the region. Both sides see themselves as reacting defensively. Both sides see the other as aggressive, and both sides carry historical memories that shape modern politics. The story of America and Iran is not simply a story about religion or ideology. It is also about oil, Cold War politics, revolution, nationalism, foreign intervention, regional power. The 1953 coup continues to shape Iranian distrust of the United States. The hostage crisis continues to shape American distrust of Iran. And each new conflict tends to reinforce the fears and narratives already present on both sides. Understanding this history does not require supporting either government uncritically, but it does require recognizing that modern conflicts rarely emerge out of nowhere. They are built over decades, sometimes generations. Now on to the modern conflict with Iran. Trump, Iran, and the dangers of another endless war. Over the last 2 decades, Americans have watched the United States become deeply entangled in conflicts across the Middle East: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Each war was presented as necessary. Each war was solid as protection, liberation, or national security. And each conflict left behind instability, enormous financial costs, civilian deaths, and long-term geopolitical consequences. Now, tensions with Iran have escalated dramatically under President Donald Trump's administration during the ongoing 2026 conflict. After U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iranian targets earlier this year, the region has moved dangerously close to the border to a broader war. Ceasefires remain fragile. Oil prices have surged, and military escalation continues to loom over the Middle East. In this episode, I want to give an opinion, not just a history lesson. I want to talk about why I believe escalating war with Iran was the wrong decision, why repeating interventionist policies is dangerous, and what realistic alternatives might look like. moving forward. This is not a defense of the Iranian government. Iran's leadership has committed serious human rights abuses, supported militant proxy groups, and engaged in aggressive regional behavior. But opposing war does not require a regime, and criticizing American foreign policy does not mean ignoring the actions of America's adversaries. The question is this: does military escalation with Iran actually make the world safer, or does it repeat the same cycle that has already destabilized the Middle East for decades? The problem with escalation. One of the biggest problems with modern geopolitics is that military action is often treated as the first serious option instead of the last. The Trump administration justifies strikes and aggressive policies toward Iran largely through nuclear fears, regional security concerns, Iranian support for militant groups, and protection of allies such as Israel. But history should make Americans extremely cautious about claims that war will produce stability. The Iraq War was sold as necessary to prevent catastrophe. Instead, hundreds of thousands died, trillions were spent, extremist groups expanded, regional instability worsened, and many of the power vacuums created in the region helped strengthen Iran's influence rather than weaken it. That's one of the great ironies of American intervention in the Middle East. Efforts meant to contain instability often create more of it. Why Iran is different from Iraq. Some people talk about Iran as though it would be another quick military campaign. That is deeply unrealistic. Iran is geographically massive, heavily populated, military entrenched, politically complex. It also possesses strong regional networks and proxy alliances. Even limited conflict risks attacks on shipping routes, economic shocks, retaliatory strikes, and regional escalation. The Strait of Hormuz alone is one of the most important oil transit routes in the world. Conflict there has already contributed to rising oil prices and economic anxiety. And unlike smaller interventions, conflict with Iran risks dragging multiple powers into confrontation indirectly: Israel, Gulf states, Russia, China, regional militias. This is not a contained situation. The moral problem. There's also a moral dimension here that often gets ignored in political rhetoric. Modern war is rarely surgical. Even precision and strikes destroy infrastructure, destabilize civilian life, increase suffering, create refugees, traumatize populations, and ordinary civilians usually suffer the most. Meanwhile, political leaders often frame war in simplified moral language: freedom versus evil, democracy versus tyranny, civilization versus terrorism. Reality is usually much messier. Governments can be authoritarian and dangerous, while war against them can be catastrophic and strategically foolish. Both things can be true at once. The endless cycle of enemy creation. Another problem is that intervention often creates future hostility. The United States and Iran already carry decades of distrust. The 1953 CIA-backed coup, support for the Shah, sanctions, proxy conflicts, military confrontations. Every escalation deepens the narrative each side tells about the other. American leaders describe Iran as an existential threat. Iranian leaders describe America as an imperial aggressor, and every strike, sanction, or retaliation reinforces those narratives. That makes diplomacy hard over time. The economic cost. War also carries enormous domestic consequences. Americans often focus only on battlefield outcomes while ignoring inflation, fuel prices, military spending, national debt, long-term instability. Recent polling shows many Americans remain unclear about the actual goals of the current conflict, while also expressing concern about rising economic costs. And this raises a deeper question. What exactly is the achievable endgame? Regime change? Containment? Deference? History suggests these goals are often far easier to announce than accomplish. What should have happened instead? So what are the alternatives? Critics of war are often accused of offering no solutions, but military escalation is not the only option available. Here are several approaches that, in my opinion, would have been wiser than moving toward open conflict. 1. Return to negotiation and diplomacy. Diplomacy is frustrating, slow, and imperfect, but war is usually worse. The nuclear agreement negotiated in 2015 was not perfect, but it at least created inspections, communication channels, restrictions, de-escalation mechanisms. Diplomatic agreements can buy time, reduce tensions, and prevent spirals toward direct war. 2. Reduce regional escalation. The Middle East has become a network of proxy conflicts. Every military action risks triggering multiple reactions across the region. A smarter strategy would involve regional negotiations, pressure on all sides to reduce proxy warfare, international mediation. Escalation rarely stays contained. 3. Separate criticism of governments from hatred of populations. One of the biggest mistakes in modern politics is treating entire populations as enemies because of governments. Ordinary Iranian civilians are not identical to Iran's ruling structure. Many Iranians themselves oppose aspects of their government. War tends to strengthen authoritarian narrative rather than weaken them. Invest more in long-term stability than military dominance. This is number 4, by the way. Military force can destroy targets. It is much worse at creating stable societies. Long-term stability usually comes from economic opportunity, diplomacy, reduced extremism, political reform, international cooperation. Those solutions are slower but often far more effective. Why this matters beyond Iran. This conversation is larger than one president or one country. It's about whether humanity keeps repeating the same geopolitical patterns, fear, escalation, retaliation, and endless cycles of conflict. Modern warfare has become technologically advanced, but politically and psychologically, humanity often behaves in remarkable ancient ways. Every generation believes this war will finally solve the problem, and yet the instability continues. Alright, conclusion. In my opinion, escalating conflict with Iran was the wrong direction. Not because Iran's government is innocent, not because the situation is simple, but because history repeatedly shows that large-scale military escalation in the Middle East often creates consequences far beyond what political leaders predict. War can remove targets. It cannot easily remove ideology, resentment, nationalism, historical memory, and once conflicts expand, controlling the consequences becomes incredibly difficult. If the goal is long-term peace and stability, diplomacy, however frustrating, still remains more promising than repeating another cycle of destruction. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Feel free to check out my website and the notes. I also have a link to my Patreon page if you want to financially support me, as these podcasts take a lot of time to put together. Every dollar helps. I hope you have a nice day.